God knows who is saved before we are born. This appears to be unjust and indeed, rather random. There is also a degree of absurdity associated with the scenario, at least from mankind's perspective, confined to a linear conception of time. If God sees all of history before time is even created, then he is not just creating us, he creates our entire history and lived experience, before time begins. This means we are predestined in the sense of predetermined. Predestination is a theological concept, primarily associated with Christian doctrine. As an idea it refers to the belief that God has foreordained all events, including the eternal destiny of individuals, salvation or damnation. This appears to many as the only possible conclusion given that God is all-powerful and created everything. However, that has not stopped it from being a contentious issue. Predestination theology has sparked debates about free will, divine sovereignty, and human responsibility. The competing issues is how can God be all-powerful if man has free will, but if man does not have free will then how can it be said that man is a sinner, let alone evil? This conflict between free will and the sovereignty of God is the key issues, but there are others. How then do we reconcile God's absolute control over all events with human free will? If God predestines everything, are humans truly free to make choices, particularly regarding salvation? How can humans be held accountable for their actions if their fate is already determined? Predestination is important primarily because it refers to who will be saved and who will be damned, and why. The debate exists because Christians have been able to interpret biblical passages on predestination, e.g., Romans 8 verses 29 to 30, Ephesians 1 verses 4 to 5, John 6 verse 44, differently. Some see these as evidence of absolute divine control, while others interpret them as compatible with human choice. A strong view of predestination can lead to fatalism, where individuals feel their actions don't matter, or to despair if they believe they are not among the elect. Calvinism, Reformed tradition, accepts God has sovereignly predestined all events, including who will be saved, the elect, and who will be damned, the reprobate, based solely on his will, not human merit. Calvinist theology believes God chooses the elect without regard to their actions or faith and that those chosen by God cannot resist his call to salvation. Romans 9 verses 11 to 22 and Ephesians 1 verses 4 to 5 are quoted as supporting the Calvinist position. And while the critics of the Calvinist position may argue this view undermines free will and portrays God as arbitrary or unjust, claiming some are predestined to damnation without choice, the point is no one deserves to be saved and it is ultimately totally up to God who is saved and why. Mankind has no grounds for being critical of anything God does, even if it appears to conflict with their logic or sense of morality. There are or were several ways mankind has thought of predestination. Many were considered heresies by the Catholic Church. Arminianism is the belief that God predestines based on his foreknowledge of human choices. He knows who will freely accept his grace, and predestination is conditional on faith. In Arminian theology God elects those he foresees will believe in Christ. Humans have free will and therefore, the ability to accept or reject God's grace. Christ's sacrifice is available to all, not just the elect. Arminians believe 1 Timothy 2:4, 2 Peter 3:9, and Romans 8 verse 29 support the Arminian position. However, Calvinists argue that Arminianism diminishes God's sovereignty by making salvation dependent on human decisions. Catholics on the other hand, while affirming the idea of predestination, emphasizes the balance between divine grace and human free will. God desires all to be saved, but humans must cooperate with his grace. In the Catholic view, predestination is seen as God's initiative to offer salvation, but humans are free to accept or reject it. The Church rejects double predestination, denying that God predestines anyone to damnation. Salvation involves both faith and works, enabled by God's grace. This view is said to be supported by John 6 verse 44, and 2 Timothy 2 verse 4. On the other hand, Protestants argue this view overemphasizes human cooperation, potentially undermining the sufficiency of God's grace. It is difficult to understand how one is predestined to be saved if one can choose not to be saved. Lutheranism is similar to Calvinism in that Lutherans affirm predestination in the positive but deny it in the negative. Lutherans believe God elects those who will be saved, but denies he decides who will be damned. An interesting conundrum. Open theism is a modern approach that challenges traditional predestination by suggesting God's foreknowledge is not exhaustive. God knows all possible outcomes but not necessarily which choices humans will make. That, however, hardly makes God any more knowledgeable than your average human. Open theists think human free will is deterministic, whereas God's plans are flexible, adapting to human decisions. This position is derived from Jeremiah 18 verses 7 to 10, and Exodus 32 verse 14. These are notable for not being Christian texts. Molinism, proposed by Luis de Molina, suggests God has middle knowledge, scientia media. Knowing what every person would freely choose in any circumstance. God uses this knowledge to predestine events while preserving free will. Universalist theologians argue that God predestines all to salvation, though this view is considered heretical by most Orthodox traditions. Needless to say, as is the case concerning the issue of sin and free will, the predestination debate touches on questions of the power of God relative to the power of free choice in human beings. The question being, can free will and divine sovereignty coexist? Compatibilists, often Calvinists, argue humans are free to act according to their desires, even if those desires are shaped by God's will. The situation is made clearer if we accept the doctrine of two races and realities. God created a world that man rejected. Man is saved when he is restored to God's graces through the sacrifice of Christ. We are damned as Homo sapiens sapiens because this is a cursed race. All who are born of the flesh will be condemned to hell. There is no reconciliation possible for this race of the flesh. However, due to the saving grace of Christ, a new race has emerged, one that is predestined to be saved. Those born of the Spirit are predestined to be saved. The crucial question is, who will be born again, and this depends on the how. We are all born in the flesh and we all mature in the flesh. But this race is condemned to die, and die we all do. There is no salvation beyond the grave. But that is for the flesh, because flesh cannot be saved. In heaven we are given a new body and a new name. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 1, Revelations 2:17. All who enter into the grace of God through the agency of His church, will be saved. Those whom we bind on earth will be bound in heaven. The old man dies and the new one is reborn. So all in the flesh dies, and in the reborn, the flesh also dies. But because we are reborn in Christ, we are predestined to be saved, for those who are in Christ are the ones in Christ, as the church, are predestined to be saved, as the church, as the bride of Christ. Our faith saves us because it is our faith that causes us to die to the flesh to be reborn in Christ.